am trying to get real with myself and with other white people, and it is painful work. There's a whole lot of blame toward black people for being the cause of how white people treat them, and I'm trying to get to the bottom of that. I decided to take a closer look at slavery, since that's such a big topic in the United States. There has been slavery all over the world forever, and all colors of people have enslaved other colors of people for as long as we know about. But the transatlantic slave trade, in which Europeans brought African and Caribbean black people to the United States to be free labor in the new colonies before they were really the United States, is a whole different story of slavery. Slavery historically had to do with who won and who lost a war, who was convenient, who stumbled by at the wrong time, and so it wasn't specifically race-based. So why did these white Europeans choose black people to enslave? Because their physical differences from whites made it easier to create lies that they were biologically inferior. They invented science to defend this. It was easier to make these people who looked so different from us less human. And that lie made it easier to justify torture, rape, family separation, and death on a massive scale. And it made them, quite frankly, easier to identify if they tried to escape. The legacy didn't disappear when slavery ended. Eugenics came along and fed the racial superiority notion of whiteness, and it influenced the Nazi narrative along with the racial one. It carried over into segregation, Jim Crow, housing, policing, incarceration, education, all of that. If we're ever going to fix what's broken, we need to get curious enough to name how it got broken in the first place. White people need to get curious so we can say no more, not on my watch. It was 1607 when English settlers were sent by the Virginia Company of England to found Jamestown in Virginia, the first colony in the Americas. The goal of the Virginia Company was to get rich. The settlers had their own agendas like religious freedom and escaping tyranny, but the Virginia Company was their ride. 12 years later, in 1619, the first ship carrying African slaves got there. That was no coincidence. That was 1600's prime delivery, a gift from the Virginia Company. They had been watching Spain and Portugal profit from enslaved Africans for many years, since the 1400s, and they swiped their business model. They also used indentured servants. Some of my ancestors were indentured servants. But there's some disagreement about whether the African slaves were originally indentured, but it didn't really matter because they ended up being chattel.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm hoping that you're doing super great from wherever you're watching me from. As you know, I'm your host and presenter Indentured. Well, I'm hoping that you are doing super great from wherever you're watching me from. Now, there's a blame that black people are usually subjected to, and the blame is anything wrong that happens, it is always black people who are being blamed, and black people are being blamed for the wrongs that white people do to them. And this has raised a question, and we are seeing these white women trying to come up with facts on why she thinks this happens. Alongside that, I'm also having a presentation in regards to the same, because we have a lot of things that have always been said about black people across the world, but our focus in the United States. Why is it that anything wrong happening in the United States, usually the blame is always the black people? Why is it that if there is a community that wants help, the pressure is always put towards black people? So you get to realize that all these things keep on just surrounding black people. What's that special that is in black people? But today, that's not our focus. But the same question we are asking: why are people always blaming black people for the wrong things that are usually happening? When they need help, they still call black people. This includes white people, Latinos, Asian Americans. all people across the world, they always call for the black voices. But at the same time, black people are the most blamed people. Now, the tendency to blame black people for how white people treat them is a deeply rooted phenomenon in white supremacist thoughts and broader societal structure. It is not only unjust, but also intellectually dishonest, as it ignores the historical, systematic, and institutional nature of racism. This blame shifting reflects a broader ideological strategy to maintain power while escaping accountability. In this response, people do mistakes, especially white folks. They do mistake, and then the mistake is being passed to a black person. And now, since you're black, you are naturally in a position to be questioned. So I want us to watch this video. As you know, I'm your host and presenter, Eugene Stories. If you're watching us for the first time, I'll most definitely ask you to subscribe to the channel, join our membership, and really get to see what it can offer you. But until then, let's watch the video. I'll be back.
White indentured servants had contracts, and they had a shot at freedom after 4 to 7 years usually. When their time was up, they often got land or goods to help them start fresh. Black Africans were enslaved for life, and to ensure that they stayed that way, the colonists made laws about it. If your mama was a slave, you were a slave, your kids were slaves. There really wasn't a way out. But that was the plan all along, because think of the business aspects of it. Once you bought a person, you never had to buy them again. You never had to pay them except to keep them fed well enough that they didn't die, and you could breed them. It's disgusting. To make people feel okay about all this, language became peppered with things like, they're childlike and they need our guidance. Does that ring a bell with anything you might hear today? Like, they just need more discipline at home. They need stronger role models. It's all victim blaming, dog whistles, gaslighting, and it's still part of the culture. And it carries down from way the hell back then. The colonists passed laws to make sure slaves did not learn to read because an educated slave was bad for business. Fast forward to Reagan's trickle-down economics theory. That never worked when it came to wealth. The rich just hoarded their money. But racism trickles. It always has. And it can be so effective that white people don't recognize it as racism because we aren't looking for it. We're too comfortable. Get curious and follow for episode 3, when race became law, the unnatural birth of whiteness. I've never owned anyone. My neighbors, as far as I know, have never been owned by anyone. But the people who say we don't owe any reparations for the Civil War are ignoring something really huge. Or maybe they just don't know. Some people already got reparations. White people. White enslavers were paid for losing their human property. The actual people who were raped, tortured, whipped, and sold, and worse, were promised land to get a fresh start after the war, but they got nothing. When slavery was abolished, Congress paid nearly $1 million, which is 30 million in today's bucks, to white enslavers as compensation for losing their property in a war they lost. If a freed person didn't hit the road fast enough, they risked being re-enslaved under new laws that were just workarounds for all these white people losing their slaves. After the Civil War ended, Union General Sherman set aside 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land for black families to start new lives on. Up to 40 acres each. The Army loaned out mules to help them work the land. That's where the phrase 40 acres and a mule comes from. Black people were already working some of this land when Lincoln was assassinated and Andrew Johnson became president. Well, Johnson reversed the order. He gave the land back to the same Confederates who had just tried to destroy the country. The freed people were evicted. So they made all these things into crimes that were non-crimes. They were things like, if a black person didn't have a job, that was a crime. If a black person couldn't prove that they had a job, that was a crime. You could get arrested for that and a lot of other ridiculous things. But once you were in jail, you could be leased out as labor for private profit. This system of convict leasing allowed white landowners and businesses to replace slavery with something just as violent, just as profitable as slavery. No wonder there are still Confederate flags all across the South. Even after slavery was abolished, Black Americans were not safe. Public lynchings became a regular threat. They were a form of terror used to keep freed people in their place. They were planned events announced in advance so everybody could attend. They were held in broad daylight. White families brought their children to watch black people being hanged, tortured, brutally murdered. It was a festival. People sold food. There were postcards made. People could buy postcards of the mutilated bodies hanging from trees and mail them in the mail or keep them as souvenirs. This country took care of Civil War criminals and punished the ones the war was supposed to free. And there was a lot more abuse I just can't fit into this video. Next time I'm going to talk about the stuff that happened in relation to the Great Depression and World War II. And then after that, I'll have one on civil rights, the era when I was growing up, how it all ties in to the racism that is part and parcel of our grand land today. White people, you especially need to get curious. Join me in this research, and you'll find that people are willing and able to come in with their education and their experience to help you learn. You just have to be open to it. We need to be willing to be uncomfortable.
And I kept it very brief and vague on purpose. So yesterday I posted a video giving a very basic definition in my own words of what white privilege is. And I kept it very brief and vague on purpose because I had a feeling people would start arguing in the comments, which they did. But I also thought it was super interesting how many people were commenting that I have white guilt, that I want to be black, and that I'm dying for the attention of the black community. First of all, yes, I have white guilt. You should too. Anyone who grows up with the knowledge that they have systematic advantages over other people just because of historical events and historical discrimination should feel a little guilty about that. Whether or not they contributed to that is a whole other thing, but you're reaping the benefits of it. People act like white guilt is something to be ashamed of, but if you use it in the right way and you use it to further reduce injustice, it's a good thing. And when people talk about systematic injustice and things like that, and they say, oh, everyone's equal, and this is happening in the comments, there's no racism anymore, everyone's equal, obviously don't understand what systematic means. And I'm going to give an anecdotal story just to really hit this on the head. I am white, and on both sides of my family, we do not have any massive generational wealth. My mom's father is the only one of my 4 grandparents who we got any sort of generational wealth inherited from. And 99% of the wealth that we inherited from my grandfather was from selling his house. My grandfather was born in 1926 in rural North Carolina, and he was a 6'3" white man with blue eyes. And other than being white, my grandfather didn't have that many privileges. He was one of like 7 children. His mom didn't even get to high school level education, and his dad never went to college. They were not privileged in most other ways that we define privilege, but he was a white male in a very, very racist country. What his whiteness allowed him to do was work his way through college. At the time, there were colleges that weren't accepting black people, and he was accepted to college as long as he could pay for it. And he ended up getting a law degree and becoming very successful, and again, never hoarded any significant wealth, but bought a house outside of Washington, D.C. in the 50s. In a neighborhood that was redlined. And actually my mom, who was born in the 60s, remembers in the 70s when the first black family moved into their neighborhood, because it had literally been sectioned off and realtors would not sell to black families. And my mom, who is 58 years old, went to a year of segregated school. So for all of you saying it was so long ago, everyone has equal rights now, get over it. My mom remembers when the first black student joined her class in the 70s in Alexandria, Virginia. In 2015, my grandfather died, and we sold his house that he bought for around $100,000 in the 50s, and we sold it for $1 million. That money was divided among his children, and my family was able to get out of a lot of debt, and it completely reset my ability to go to private versus public school, my ability to afford tutors, my ability to become the educated person that I am. And it was all really because I have a white grandfather. Let me finish. Had my grandfather been black and had all of the other skills and background that he had, he couldn't have gone to the schools that he went to. He wouldn't have been hired in the jobs that he was. And he couldn't have bought the house that he did, that, 65 years later, put his family out of debt. So if anyone tries to tell you it's not that deep, it really is that deep. It goes so far back. Any small privilege that a white person has is probably, to some degree, due to their whiteness. And if you are a white person who has roots in the South, you definitely should have white guilt, and you definitely should be doing the work to understand how your privilege affects the people around you and how you can help level the playing field. Because you, almost 100%, have an ancestor who owned black people. So yes, I have white guilt. Yes, I'm aware of my status as a white woman, and I'm aware of the parts of my identity that are privileged and the parts that aren't. But saying that you have a certain type of privilege doesn't mean that you have every privilege. It just means that that aspect of your identity is favored by society. So I can talk about being a white woman, and that makes me privileged. But if I talk about being a woman, that is actually a disadvantage in a lot of ways. And everyone tried to get all particular about these specific situations where a black person might have a privilege or a woman might have a privilege over a man. Those are isolated situations you're bringing up. We're talking about large-scale, mass, systematic issues. And it's a lot deeper than just, I felt racism as a white person at one point. Fine, yeah, all of us can experience what feels like discrimination based on race. But that doesn't mean that it's systematically affecting you and stopping you and your families from catching up. That's really what it is. Now, yeah, legally, black people and white people should have the same exact rights and privileges. But they're playing catch up. Because if my family, like I said, had been black, we would never have gotten out of debt in 2015. I would never have been able to afford the school that I went to and live the lifestyle that I'm living right now. And that's because of effects from over 70 years ago. So thanks for listening. And yeah, white guilt's okay.
White supremacy relies on having an uneducated population, and that is exactly what Trump's administration in the White House is creating today. Anti-intellectualism isn't just concerning because individuals don't know how to read or write at a high level. It's concerning because they don't know how to recognize patterns that are happening in society. They don't want you to recognize the historic danger of banning books, or realize that in 2023 alone, more than 3,000 books were banned, mostly about sexuality, race, and gender. They don't want you to recognize that erasing history is dangerous, like how Florida changed slavery to involuntary relocation, or that the GI Bill that built the American middle class, including my family, excluded black veterans. Why? Because if you understood the way that racism is built into the foundation of this country, you would demand change. You would have to, if you have any sort of conscience. From education to housing to policing, go back 30, 50, 70, 90 years and the pattern is all there. White supremacy needs you to be uneducated and complacent in your current status. So what is the most radical thing that you can do today, especially as a white person? Get educated, read a book, stop dismissing critical race theory as woke propaganda, and actually look at the foundation of what we are saying, and you will literally be shocked. Let's talk about who the American dream was never meant for. From the start, the American dream was a myth. In the 1930s, the US government literally drew lines around primarily black neighborhoods in order to deny them loans, a process today known as redlining. Not only was this harmful because it kept black Americans out of homes, but it also denied them access to generational wealth. Meanwhile, throughout the 20th century, black workers and immigrants were exploited in factories, in mines, and in fields, while the rich got even richer. Not to mention union busting and wage theft kept families in poverty for decades, and we can even see those effects today. It's not that the American dream is broken, it's that it is a myth for the majority of people. It was meant for white middle-class people who had the resources to try to elevate themselves to the top 1%. So by supporting billionaires like Elon Musk or like Mark Zuckerberg, you are supporting a system that actively hurts minorities as well as the everyday people just like you. It's time for us to rebuild a system that is truly fair and equitable for everybody. Peace and love.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. Believing and hoping that you're doing great from wherever you're watching me from, whether it's in the morning, afternoon, daytime. I'm hoping that you're doing great. from any state that you're watching me from. Now, let's talk about the psychological mechanism of victim blaming. Victim blaming is a psychological defense mechanism that allows members of a dominant group to rationalize and distance themselves from complicity in oppression. By blaming black people for their suffering, whether through narratives about black on black crime, family breakdown, or personal responsibility, white society avoids confronting the uncomfortable truth that racism is systemic, not behavioral. This cognitive dissonance relieves guilt and sustains illusions of fairness, making it easier to uphold white supremacy while claiming moral neutrality. So, the victim blaming is something that we have seen. For example, I think you've seen these current videos that a white woman finds a black man or a black woman minding his or her business, but then she start acting like the black man did something really uncomfortable, and now she's occupying a personal space, and all these things crazily are happening. And so, what does that have to say? This shows the victimhood, because a black person generally is considered as a person who is not right. So when a case finds a black person and a white person, by default, a black person will be on the wrong, and that's how people believe, right? So when this happens, it's not like the white person really made a problem, while indeed they're the ones who did, right? I'm also going to be talking about colonial ideology and myth of inferiority. From the colonial era onward, European imperialists developed pseudoscientific and theological justification for slavery and subjugation, branding Africans as naturally inferior, lazy, immoral, or uncivilized. These myths served a dual purpose. First, to legitimize economic exploitation. Two, to blame the oppressed for their condition. If black people are poor, it was not because of systemic denial or resources. It was because they lacked work ethic. That's how they frame it. This framework continues to echo in modern discourse, where structural inequalities are erased and moral judgment are projected onto the black communities. This is something that really happens, and you know it very well. Out of nowhere, black is undesirable. Out of nowhere, black are the default problem causers in the United States. That's how they do it. And they push the myth of inferiority towards black people. And that's why you see some black people, especially in the continent, they grow knowing that there is nothing great about black people. And now we start seeing people who want to bleach their skin, want to turn how they look, right? And so when this happens, and welcome back. I'm sorry for the disruption. So when one grows knowing that there is nothing great about them, this is what they grow, and this is how they believe to be them. But this is not the true depiction of them. And this has happened to a lot of black people. This has led to something called self-hate, right? Because when you look at history, you find that there is nothing great about you. And now you look at other people, you find that they are desirable, because that's how history lied to you and hate you, made you believe to be inferior. And that's the myth of inferiority, right? So the colonial ideology and the myth of inferiority, this is a blame that is put to black people, knowing that there is nothing great that they did, while in reality, they did great things, right? I'm also going to be talking about post-slavery blame as a tool of social control. After the abolition of slavery, white societies were forced to invent new ways to justify racial inequality without legal institution of chattel bondage. Jim Crow laws, segregation, redlining, and voter suppression were implemented to preserve white dominance, but they were masked under the language of legality, morality, and order. The narrative shifted. Black people were not enslaved anymore. So if they were still suffering, it must be their own fault. This blame functioned to obscure the continuing systemic barriers and justify policies that perpetuated black marginalization. So all these are blames that are being pushed towards black people, and they didn't do this, but still, it's being pushed towards them. Also, media representation and pathology of blackness. This is also another important factor that we need to talk about. Mainstream media, especially in the 20th and 21st century, has played a central role in constructing and reinforcing stereotypes that blame black people for their own oppression. Talk about betrayal. Talk about the portrayal of black people as violent black male to the welfare queen. These images are seeped into the public consciousness. They serve to pathologize black life while erasing the historical traumas. Slavery, police violence, redlining, generational poverty that create the very conditions being criticized. By promoting these creatures, media narratives help white audiences justify racist beliefs and policies. That's how they do. Also, talk about respectability politics and the burden of behavioral redemption. Blaming black people also manifests in the form of respectability politics. The idea that if black individuals dress right, speak right, or act civilized, they earn white respect and escape racism. But history shows that even the most respectable black people, the MLK, Malcolm X, Sandra Bland, have been criminalized or killed. This reveals that white hostility is not based on behavior, but on skin color and perceived threat to dominance. They demand that black people constantly prove their humanity is itself a form of violence, right? Talk about white liberalism and shifting of responsibilities. Really, really important. Even among self-identified white liberals or those who refer themselves as allies, there is often a subtle tendency to shift responsibility back to black people. This shows up in questions like, what can the black community do to fix this? Or why don't they vote more? Such kind of questions, right? Which seemingly benign ignore systemic voter suppression, disinvestment in black education, or economic exclusion. By framing these issues as lack within the community rather than the result of policy and oppression, liberals maintain the illusion of a fair system that simply needs better participation. Also going to be addressing the erasure of structural racism in public discourse. American society is structured to obscure systemic racism and replace it with narratives of individual responsibility. Policies that harm black people, such as the mass incarceration, predatory lending, or school segregation, are explained away through race-neutral language. When black people resist or expose these systems, they are accused of playing the race card or being divisive. This rhetorical move shifts focus from systemic individuals, making it easier to blame the oppressed rather than the structures that oppresses. Also, let's talk about internalized racism and intra-community blame. Decades of exposure to the toxic narrative have also led some black individuals to internalize blame. Internalized racism causes members of marginalized groups to adopt the dominant society negative beliefs about themselves and their people. These can lead to intra-community shaming, generational tension, and lateral aggression. It's another tragic result of a system that conditions people to believe that their own suffering is their fault, rather than the result of orchestrated social exclusion. Right? Talk about the myth of capitalism and the myth of meritocracy. Capitalism fuels a narrative that success or failure is purely the result of individual effort. In such a system, poverty and oppression are seen as a result of laziness, not systemic barrier. Black people are disproportionately impacted by the racial capitalism, yet they are often blamed for not pulling up themselves by their bootstraps. This myth of meritocracy is weaponized to justify economic inequality while erasing the racial hierarchy that underpins the system itself. Right. Also, talk about educational curricula and historical distortion, and I've talked about this for the longest time. The American education system plays a significant role in perpetuating these false narratives. School curricula often sanitize or omit the brutal realities of slavery, colonization, Jim Crow, and the contemporary racism. Without an accurate understanding of history, generations of Americans grow up believing that Black people's struggles are self-inflicted rather than systemic. This educational neglect allows false blame to be normalized and reproduced across time. Right? Talk about the weaponization of black crime. This is also another blame that has been shifted towards Black people. One of the most insidious examples of this blame is the weaponization of the term black on black crime. True interracial violence exists in all communities, which is true. We also have white on white crime. Only Black people are framed as uniquely violent or self-destructive. This framing ignores the role of poverty, lack of opportunity, police underprotection, and generational trauma. Conditions manufactured by systemic racism, it becomes a way to shift blame onto victims rather than interrogate the system that produces the crime. Right? All in all, what do we have to say about this? This is all I have to say. Liberation requires a new framework. To break free from this cycle of blame, society must adopt a new framework, one that centers historical truth, the first one, acknowledges power dynamics, and listens to Black voices. Blame is a form of gaslighting that prevents healing and justice. Instead of asking Black people to fix their condition, we must ask who built the system that kept them oppressed. Only by shifting the lens from individual blame to systemic accountability can we begin to dismantle the mechanisms of white supremacy and build a more equitable world. Thank you guys for taking your time to watch this video. I'm your host and presenter Indentured Stories. But until then, let me see you in my next video. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.